Welcome to the Rum Ration podcast. I'm Colin Robinson along with Ayesha Chatterjee, and we're delighted to have you join us for a deep dive into gas warfare. It might be deeper than some of you were really hoping for, but man, oh man, if you want to know about all the history behind gas warfare, you come to the right place. And to get us kicked off, we don't just get into the technical parts, we're going to get into the emotional parts. We have a professional poet joining us for a special reading. Today, to really set the stage for this episode about the terrors of gas warfare, we're going to start off with a reading of a poem that I have to admit has haunted me ever since I first read it. This famous poem, Dulce Et Decorum Est, was written by Wilfred Owen, military cross holder, during World War I. And tragically, and I'll say it again, tragically, was only published posthumously in 1920. Its Latin title is from a verse written by the Roman poet Horace, Dulce et decorum e pro matria mori. In English, this means it is sweet and right to die for one's country. Now, fear not. You don't have to worry about Rejoy and his fancy little imitations and his voices, or I trying to do any justice to this reading. No, we've gone and used all the sponsorship dollars from our imaginary sponsors, and we've blown the entire Rum Ration podcast production budget on hiring, believe it or not, a professional poet to read it for us. That's right. We are featuring a professional, full-time, that's her job, poet, Ayesha Chatterjee. Ayesha was born and raised in India. She lived in 5 countries across 3 continents, including England, USA, and Germany, before making her home in Toronto. She's the author of 2 poetry collections, The Clarity of Distance and Bottles and Bones. Her work has appeared in journals internationally such as The Moth in Ireland, Magma Poetry, UK, and Exile Literary Quarterly in Canada, among others. And she's also been translated into several languages, maybe questionable choices on some of these, including French, Slovene, and Russian. Ayesha is a past president of the League of Canadian Poets, and she currently chairs the League's Feminist Caucus. We're delighted to have her join us today. I'm very privileged to be able to call her a friend. Welcome to the Rum Ration podcast, Ayesha.
Thank you so much. That's a brilliant introduction, Colin. And I'm really, really delighted to be reading this poem. It's one of my favorite poems by Wilfred Owen as well. The other one is, of course, Anthem for Doomed Youth, which is the other really, really well-known poem of his. But it's such a brilliant poem and very, very vivid and very immediate, I think, and really hard-hitting. And I've just always loved it. I know that you just told me how much you love it too.
Yeah, there's one line in there that we can talk about afterward, perhaps, which is always just, it's gripped me. And anyone who's ever done any NBCD training, nuclear, biological, chemical defense training in the armed forces, and has had to wrestle with their gas mask would totally get it. So I'm sure they'll click in when you do the reading. So thank you very much.
Okay, my pleasure. So I'm just going to go into it now.
Anytime.
Okay, here we go. Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched to sleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil's, sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues? My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie. Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori.
Wow, that was unbelievable.
Yeah.
It almost made me cry. That's that. No, I'm serious. That's so powerful. Like it really, the way you read it, it really captures just absolute horrors of not just gas warfare, but just World War One and the trenches and everything combined. And thank you so much for bringing that really to life for us. And well, I
Yeah.
got to say, one of the other reasons I'm haunted by this poem is the tragedy and the enormous sadness of Wilfred Owen's own death. He was killed in action on the 4th of November, 1918, during the crossing of the Sambre-Oise Canal, exactly 1 week, almost, believe it or not, to the hour before the signing of the armistice, which ended the war. And he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant the day after his death. So he was killed as a second lieutenant, but the promotion came through the day after. And his poor mother received a telegram informing her of his death on Armistice Day, just
That's
as a church,
just so
just
tragic.
just as the church bells were in Shrewsbury were ringing out in celebration in our town. Can you imagine?
I honestly can't. That's just devastating, I think. Must be for a mother especially to get the news then, just when you think that it's all over. I can't imagine.
Can't imagine. Can't
Um,
imagine. Well, thank you so much, Ayesha. Really appreciate this. I'm going to stop the recording here, and then Rejoy and I will kick it off with the whole episode about the horrors of chemical warfare, horrors of gas warfare, and your reading really brought it to life. Thank you.
Well, that was quite incredible, wasn't it, Colin?
That was
And
unbelievable.
I know that that's one of your favorite poems. We've
It
talked
is.
about that a
It
little bit.
is, and I'm so glad that you happen to know somebody not too far. I mean, we did blow a lot of our expense budget trying to hire the best poet in all of Canada.
I have no more savings, but she is the household poet laureate and well-deserved title, and really delivered on that. It was quite moving, especially that part about gas boys, and like
Oh, the fumbling towards ecstasy, like, oh my
mm,
God, it just grabs
mm.
us. Any of us who've done gas drills and
Yes,
and that fumbling and trying to get the gas mask on in time, and
I think coming out with your eyes streaming, coughing your lungs out, and that's just a small taste of non-lethal
that's
gas.
just CS gas. That's easy.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a great lead into what we're talking about today, which has got to be one of the most terrifying weapons ever invented in the history of mankind. And you know what strikes me as being very interesting is the fact that it's not new. I mean, World War One is probably the global introduction of gas warfare, where us as military history students and lovers of military history discovered the whole story about gas. But it dates way back, doesn't it? I mean, it goes back into antiquity, actually. But it was the First World War that turned it into an industrialized weapon.
And given how horrible it was shut down pretty quickly afterwards. Like all the great powers were terrified. We'll get into that, like why Hitler didn't use it, why Stalin didn't use it, because of their own experiences and how scared they were of it.
So today we're going to talk about how gas was turned into basically a device to turn the air into poison itself.
Absolutely, turn the air into a weapon, and how Canadian troops, especially those of our beloved, we are biased, the Royal Montreal Regiment, faced down the horrors of gas warfare in the trenches of World War One.
Indeed, but before we get into clouds of chlorine and crusted gas masks, let's lighten the air a little. This episode is unofficially, irreverently, and questionably brought to you by
Black Lung Lager, brewed in the depths of history, coal black, trench strong, and filtered through something that definitely isn't charcoal.
Whether you're dodging artillery or dodging small talk at the mess dinner, Black Lungs got your back.
Black Lung Lager, breathe deep, drink deeper. Who writes this shit? Like, why are we surprised that we're not getting any sponsors?
Just happy we've got subscribers at this point. So
we're going to do something a little bit differently here today, folks.
Yeah.
We've tried to comprise things in a series of questions. We've got a whole bunch of questions that we're going to answer into great detail. And Rejo is going to kick us off with the first question, and I'll do my best at answering it.
So this is a great question. What was the first use of gas in warfare, and who used it?
Yeah, so most people, like Rejo was saying at the start, trace gas warfare back to 1915. And given our Western bias, we'll say it happened at the Second Battle of Ypres. But the reality is, if you dig a little bit deeper, okay, it was used by the Russians first, and on the Eastern Front, and you go back a little bit further, there was other evidence of it being used by the French in 1914. But the idea of using poison in combat dates back centuries. The Athenians, around 600 BCE, poisoned a city's water supply with hellebore, which is a toxic plant that induces violent diarrhea. Well, that's fun. How could you tell it wasn't just regular diphtheria? Spartan forces, a century later, tried choking their enemies by burning sulfur and pitch beneath city walls, which I guess would be the real first start of of gas warfare.
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah.
That's pretty rough. And let's not forget those ancient connoisseurs of warfare. The Romans were also in on the whole game. During the siege of Dura-Europos, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in the 3rd century CE, the Sasanians used burning bitumen and sulfur crystals in tunnels, creating a lethal gas cocktail that killed at least 20 Roman soldiers, which is a drop in the bucket compared to what happened. But still, there you have it. After all, nothing says I surrender like your city smelling like death and expired cheese.
Yeah.
These ancient examples, though, they show the idea of poisoning the air wasn't new, just the method.
Right, but it was in World War I that poison gas really entered the industrial age on a large scale. And France was the first to use tear gas grenades in 1914, containing a non-lethal irritant that they used against the German troops. So basically like a tear gas. Yeah, these grenades caused eye irritation and discomfort, but they weren't intended to kill. Their effectiveness was minimal, largely due to unreliable delivery methods and limited impact. And you and I have both experienced the joys of tear gas, so we can't just poo-poo it. It is kind of miserable, especially if you don't have a gas mask on that. But the first large-scale lethal gas attack happened on April 22nd, 1915, at Ypres, also known as the Second Battle of Ypres. The Germans released 170 metric tons of chlorine gas across 4 miles, so 6.5 kilometers of frontage, killing over 1,100 and injuring thousands. It was the moment the world realized the air could kill. So that's the start of it all. Rejoy, could you tell us, how did gas warfare evolve from 1915 through to World War II and beyond?
So the interesting thing is, after the initial chlorine attacks, militaries quickly advanced their chemical arsenals. They saw how effective this weapon had become. Phosgene, introduced by the Germans later in 1915, an even deadlier chemical, was colorless, smelled like musty hay, and was 6 times deadlier than chlorine. It could be inhaled without immediate symptoms, only to cause fluid-filled lungs later. That's absolutely terrifying. You breathe it in, you can't smell it,
and then all of a sudden you don't really notice it, and then you don't notice the effects right away.
Yeah, and then suddenly later in the day, you're not feeling so good. You can't breathe.
Yeah.
Terrible.
And if anyone wants to know more, we should say about the guy who really was the architect of all this, the inventor, Haber. Haber? How do you pronounce
Fritz
it?
Haber. Yeah.
Fritz Haber. You can go back to our previous episode, episode number 11, I believe it was, and Rejoy gave a pretty good overview of what a miserable prick he was. Give you an idea how a lovely character. He got the not the Peace Prize, but he got the Nobel Prize.
Nobel Prize.
He did. Prize. But his wife committed suicide. She was so horrified by what he had done to stop gas warfare.
What a great guy he was.
Great guy. But back to the gas warfare here. Mustard gas came along in 1917, which was a real game changer.
Yeah.
Unlike chlorine or phosgene, mustard gas caused severe chemical burns on contact with the skin. It blistered the skin and lungs. It incapacitated soldiers. It contaminated terrain. So it was a good way to deny a certain area to people by just to the enemy by you dropping mustard on there. You can't go through it. And it would linger on the clothing and equipment, causing prolonged suffering. So even if you're wearing a gas mask, your body was still quite vulnerable. And we've seen those pictures before.
We have,
yes. Swelling.
Yes.
Poor bastards.
Yes. And those are the really evocative images that one has of the First World War, right?
I remember doing a display at the McGill Medical Center. They had a little World War I display, and we were looking at those and all the blisters and this and that. And one of the doctors pointed out, they had those soldiers. You see those blisters on the outside; they'd had the same thing on the inside in their lungs.
Oh Jesus!
Oh my God! Because that's where you hear them drowning in their own. Just what there was, the blister would fill up with fluid, and then they would burst, and then they would drown in their own Holy shit. Good times. Who chose
Yeah,
this idea?
it just kind of makes you stop and think, does it? Actually makes you stop and think about the whole thing. And it wasn't just the gas that evolved, the delivery methods did as well. So early attacks used stationary gas cylinders, which weren't very, very effective. But by late 1915, all sides were firing gas in artillery shells, enabling greater range and control. So now you've got high explosive, you've got all sorts of artillery coming at you, and guess what?
Shrapnel.
Shrapnel. Now we're introducing gas to the mix.
Yay!
The British and French color-coded their shells by gas type, green for phosgene, yellow for mustard gas, fitting, while the Germans refined their tactics with mixed agents and persistent chemicals. So by 1917, devices like the British Livens projector could saturate enemy lines with gas in seconds, turning poison from a shock weapon into a grim fixture of trench warfare.
Yeah, I got two comments on what you just said. First of all, those early stationary gas cylinders, really encourage the listeners to look up those pictures of the Germans doing that. I think that would have taken a fair amount of courage to be that close. You see the clouds of gas that are coming right out of the cylinders, and they're right there, and they've got this teeny little, like, not even COVID-style mask on.
Yes.
Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, it was pretty high risk.
Probably saying, this is not such a good idea, yeah?
But the second thing would be, you talk about the mix of shells. What a huge impact that would have in terms of really messing with the enemy, right? Because you'd be doing an HE attack, you drive them into their, or if they're open in the open, you do some overhead bursts, air bursts, and drive them to ground, and then they're trying to find their way around. They just drop in a couple of gas grenades while you're doing it at the same time, or gas shells. Like, Jesus.
And there's some, I mean, they both sides drew up some very complex artillery firing plans, didn't they? I mean, you could see it later on in the documentation how they planned, first we'll hit, depending where they're attacking, start off with HE, then hit them with that, and then saturate it with gas, and then go back to HE, and then go over the top. So again, that idea of brainless slaughter that most people think about the First War.
Yeah.
It's not true. It's not true. It's just that the weapons had evolved, and it's like what's happening in the Ukraine-Russian front right now. Same sort of thing. All of a sudden, there are drones, and
then counter drones, and the next thing you know, you've got drone jamming, and the next thing you know, you've got fiber optic guided drones that you can't jam, and then there'll be something else. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's a really good point you make about doing your mix of shelling with gas first, because imagine if you're about to do an attack, you get the enemy to put their gas mask on. Well, their visibility gets cut right down, right?
Correct.
Because you've had the joy of flopping around in a fogged up mask that hopefully it's not half full of puke. It's kind of, you can't hear properly.
Can't hear properly. Yeah.
Was that a left flanking? Was that a retreat?
Yeah. And then, of course, the discomfort of wearing those damn things as well. Let's not forget that. And ours, in our day, they were far better than what these guys had to wear. Those looked almost like sandbags over their heads.
Yeah. We'll get into that further on in the script here. So after World War I, the Geneva Protocol of 1925, and we all know that everyone, of course, follows Geneva Conventions, it banned the use, but not the development of chemical weapons. I think that's an important thing to note. You're not allowed to use it, but you can make it. So it didn't stop Italy from gassing Ethiopia in the 1930s or Spain using gas in Morocco, and it didn't stop the Cold War arms race that followed.
That's right. And the Nazis developed their own nerve agents like tabun and sarin, but they didn't deploy them in battle. The Allies feared gas reprisals and had their own stockpiles ready. And again, when you talk about evocative images, we all remember when war broke out in 1939 in London, children being issued gas masks. So there was a real fear that this was going to happen again. Only later in Syria and Iraq did we see the world truly fail its chemical weapons taboo, because the Second World War didn't see the use of chemical weapons at all.
Fail is a big word, and a lot can be laid at. I'll make myself very unpopular, but when Obama said that would be a red line and they did nothing to stop Assad, the West lost a lot of credibility. But all right, let's get back into it. This is part of a 3-part series. This is the second episode. Rejoy and I talked in our last episode about the Second Battle of Ypres, and Rejoy did a really good job of laying out the strategic perspective of it. And in the next episode, we're going to dive into a deep dive into RMR's role at the Second Battle of Ypres. So, Rejoy, could you tell us why, or I guess this is me, I'm going to talk really about why the Second Battle of Ypres was so significant. It just wasn't another offensive, right? It marked the birth of modern chemical warfare. The German forces released the chlorine gas from 6,000 cylinders. Those poor bastards who were turning the taps on them all. Not as bad as the poor bastards who were receiving it, receiving the dense green cloud that rolled across no man's land into the French, Algerian, and Canadian lines.
And the guys that got hit first, those poor buggers, were the French Algerian troops, the Turcos. Uh, and they just had no idea what the hell this thing was. Blinded and suffocating, many broke and fled, as you would expect them to do. The Canadians, including the Royal Montreal Regiment, plugged the gap, though. They faced the gas head on with no prior training and only clothes soaked in cloths soaked in urine to protect themselves. The fact that they actually plugged the gap, and I think a lot of it also had to do with the fact that you don't know what this stuff is. You know,
No,
you've
they'd
got
had
this.
they'd had a hint, as we talked about in a previous episode, of there'd been some prisoners taken and some people who had
Yeah, some deserters
deserted.
yeah.
Some deserted come across, but nobody really knew what it
No,
was, and did you believe them? Like
no.
it's
You see the French troops running. You have no idea, but okay, they're crumbling on the flank. We'll go in and plug the flank, and then hello.
But it didn't quite work out so well for the Germans, right? It was a bit of a propaganda disaster. The Germans, of course, insisted the attack was necessary to break trench deadlock, but the world really saw it as a breach of wartime ethics because there were some rules against these kind of chemical warfares. And Ypres symbolized a turning point, a moment where science and war and morality collided in the most horrifying way.
Absolutely. And you see that again, this is a war which has also been told through a very evocative war art. And some of the most moving paintings are of the Canadians at Ypres in 1915, holding off German attacks while clutching those urine-soaked cloths to their mouths. And you see the bodies around them. I mean, it really puts you right next to them and scares the hell out of you. So we have the next question. I mean, let's talk a little bit more about the troops themselves. So, Colin, the Canadian troops, how were the Canadian troops, particularly our beloved RMR, how were they affected?
Yeah, we'll get into a really deep dive into just a second about Ypres and the RMR in our next episode, which will be episode 13. But really, the RMR and all Canadians faced the gas directly during that battle. And Captain Francis Scrimger, who was the RMR's medical officer, described waves of French soldiers fleeing through his dressing station in, quote, mass fear, unquote. And soon his own men and the Canadians were clutching their throats.
Yeah, that's right. And that was just the beginning. Over the course of the war, the RMR, like all the Canadians, was bombarded with gas shells containing phosgene and mustard gas. Hard to believe, but there were approximately 12,000 Canadian gas casualties during World War I. 12,000.
Big number.
Again, those numbers are just incredible. Of course, many soldiers did not report minor gassings at the time, which were not immediately debilitating, but they suffered from chemically induced illnesses and disabilities in later years. Again, if you're not badly affected, you kind of just get on with your life. You don't really think about it. And it's only afterwards that, which happens today as well, result of other war injuries that they manifest themselves
they don't
later on.
know, is it smoke? It's annoying. There's a great picture out there that of a Canadian subaltern with his pistol, and he's escorting back about 6 or 7 German prisoners. They've all got their gas masks on. It looks all smoky around them. Is it gas? Is it not? He's just like, it's not that bad.
Yeah.
And how would that happen later? But I guess they adapted, right?
Yeah, they adapted. Yeah.
The soldiers ended up testing their gear by marching through specially designed gas trenches, just like how we use gas chambers today to test our gear. It's all about gaining confidence in your equipment. Do you remember being gassed in your training, Rejoy?
Oh, how does one forget that? That is one of the happiest moments in my life. Where the old saying, "Misery loves company," and there was a lot of misery and there was a lot of company. As you stumble out of that hellhole filled with.
The worst part is waiting, especially the first time you go through. It's the stress of waiting.
Yeah, exactly.
Waiting for it to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just remember afterwards sitting against a wall with one of the other guys there, and our eyes are still streaming. And he pulled out a pack of smokes. He said, "I think this is the time." You know, like well, yeah, of course, we've just been gassed. Absolutely, 100%. This is the time.
Probably did the exact same thing. So,
And then, like detecting gas. Now, here's the other thing. Detecting gas wasn't easy in those days. Initially, gas alarms relied on human sentries watching for signs of a gas cloud, but that wasn't always fast or reliable, especially with gases like phosgene, which was harder to see or smell. And like you said, Colin, very correctly, you don't know. Is it smoke? What is it? What's coming over there? You're not sure. But eventually, the British and other armies used a mix of canaries, mice, and other small animals, sad to say, as part of trench and tunnel gas detection systems. It's something that I think, again, we've all heard stories of, especially during, another thing we can talk about, the tunneling warfare that took place. They used to take the canaries down as well. It was a crude but effective early warning method, particularly in enclosed spaces like dugouts and tunnels where gas could collect unnoticed. So the threat was taken quite seriously by both sides, and the troops received updated respirators as the war progressed. But no defense is ever perfect.
That's true. So let's take a quick breath of clean air and remind everyone that this episode is brought to you by our favorite fictional sponsor, Black Lung Lager.
Yes, indeed. Whether you're defending a trench or defending your last word at a mess dinner, crack open a bottle of trench-born courage.
Black Lung Lager, now in limited edition, mustard finish. Sorry,
That's brilliant. That one is brilliant. Mustard finish. Oh,
mustard finish.
Premium
Yeah,
brand.
we're pretty dark humor.
So I've got another question for you, Colin. What kind of protective gear were they issued? And more importantly, did it work?
Yeah, so the early protection was kind of laughable. Gauze pads soaked in a bicarbonate of soda, or as you said, the first ones were just urine, like handkerchiefs with urine. They pissed on them. That was it. If the gas was strong, it didn't really help. And then came the hypo helmet, which was a cloth hood soaked in thiosulfate. It was better, but claustrophobic and ineffective against all but chlorine. Oh, yay. We don't really know what the gas is.
Not great. Then they had the P helmet, which was soaked in sodium phenate.
Not pee, not as in you peed on it.
No, not as a pee. But sadly, it collapsed when wet. So even if you did pee on it, it wouldn't work.
But it never got wet in the trenches, did it?
No. And it was, of course, naturally widely hated. Finally, the small box respirator arrived, complete with charcoal filter and facepiece. It could handle most gases and became standard issue. And I think that's the one that we see in the pictures of the time.
Yeah, that's right. And the troops, of course, tested these on site, marching through trenches behind the lines that were filled with chlorine gas. Yay, that's fun. And if your gear had a defect, or if you didn't get your mask on time, the results could, of course, be fatal. They weren't playing with CS gas like we do with tear gas. They were using the real stuff.
No.
So were there any firsthand accounts from the RMR that you could talk about, Rejoy?
Well, Colin, you brought up Captain Francis Scrimshaw. And we have several, and his account stands out, describing the chaos and panic as the gas rolled in. Being a medical officer, that's even more terrifying. How do you treat this stuff?
Right. Good point. Good point.
In 1917, mustard and phosgene attacks left dozens temporarily blind and coughing blood.
Yeah, one passage mentions men too nauseated to function, but too terrified to take off their masks. And others describe lying in trenches, vomiting into their helmets, unable to breathe.
That's right. These aren't just statistics, folks. They're snapshots of survival and terror in real time. The RMR's regimental history recounts an instance when, during a gas attack, I quote, "miserable in the extreme were a large number of men of numbers 1 and 3 companies under Captain J.E. McKenna, who, though violently nauseated by the phosphorus in smoke shells, dared not remove their close-filling helmets owing to the deluge of the enemy gas."
And they're just talking about the smoke shells, not even gas itself. Good Lord. Interestingly enough, though, how you just kind of get used to everything, right? So gas just became yet another inconvenience to be dealt with. In an earlier episode, Rejoy, you described how the soldiers were advancing into machine gun fire. I think it was the Vimy episode.
The Vimy episode.
Like hunch their shoulders as if walking into a brisk snow squall. And even with gas, initially a terrifying wonder weapon, it kind of became routine. Later in the war, on August 18th, 1918, the RMR history notes that, quote, gas shelling caused inconvenience on the night of the 18th, but helmets were donned and casualties avoided. This suggests that rigorous training routines, confidence in their equipment, led to the immediate reaction to gas attacks with a reliance on the protective gear, which clearly mitigated the effects of gas attacks. So it
Yes.
works, right? Training works,
Yeah.
equipment works. And another example, August 29th, 1918, so part of the last 100 days, quote, the enemy shelled the 14th Battalion with gas, causing inconvenience and 1 or 2 casualties, end quote. Meh, just gas, a couple casualties, no biggie.
It's amazing what you can get used to once the whole terrifying aspect of this new weapon, once that is passed, and you've learned to develop countermeasures to some extent.
And you
Um,
think whoever the battalion diarist who wrote that, couple 1 or 2 casualties, meaning probably not dead, and probably just kind of shrugging it off, and probably everyone involved at the time, including the guys themselves who got gas and were back at hospital, were just probably counting themselves lucky to be out of the line. But betcha, I betcha, if you were sick enough from gas exposure that you had to be evacuated through the medical system, I bet you were probably dead of cancer within 10 years.
True, I hadn't even thought about that. You're quite
Yeah.
right.
You think of all the
Yeah.
sanatoriums,
Yes,
all the tuberculosis sanatoriums that were closing
yes,
down in 1919, 1920 were suddenly filled with soldiers coming back from the war who had lung problems.
that is very true. So I'm sure there are other accounts of what it's like to be gassed. So Colin, tell us, what did it feel like to be gassed?
Well, apparently chlorine hits on the nose like pineapple and pepper. It burns the eyes, gives searing your throat, lungs that feel like they're imploding. Upon inhalation, chlorine reacts with water in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid. That's lovely, which is
Wow.
destructive to tissue, no shit, and can lead to rapid death or permanent lung damage and disability. We have an account of what it was like from Gunner William Pressey, Canadian Artillery, Second Battle of Ypres, 1915, who survived the first major German chlorine attack. And he later wrote, why don't you read the quote?
So he later wrote, it was not until the gas burst upon us that we realized what we were up against. I got a mouthful of it. It caught me in the throat, and I was helpless. I stumbled about, my eyes streaming, my lungs agonized. I coughed and gasped for breath. It felt like being choked to death by invisible fingers.
Yeah, and that was chlorine. I mean, I think most of us have had the experience of being too close at a pool by the chlorine chemicals. You kind of get a whiff of it. You lean back right away. Like it's like you can feel
Yeah,
it. It's blocking off the ability to
yeah,
breathe properly. Like,
yeah.
and I like that line there. It's very, very, very impactful. It felt like being choked to death by invisible fingers.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Can you imagine that? It's just you, and then you see some of those images, them, the soldiers clawing
Yeah,
at their
yeah, yeah.
throats, and this
Yeah.
explains it. Yeah.
The mustard gas was silent, no pain at first, just irritation. Then came the boils, the blisters, the blindness. Even weeks later, soldiers would relapse. Some never fully recovered. Apparently, had an odor reminiscent of garlic or horseradish. Others described the smell as garlic, gasoline, rubber, or dead horses, which would be tough because there were a lot of dead horses
No,
around
dead,
there. So I
no,
could see how
a
you could
lot.
get that confused. RMR experienced severe sufferings from mustard gas shelling, including temporary blindness, the badly irritated throats and lungs. Although terrifying, most soldiers regained their sight within 4 to 6 weeks, although some were permanently blinded. Private A. Smith, a British soldier who was exposed to mustard gas in 1917, recalled, quote, it was not immediate. Hours later, my skin started to blister. My eyes swelled shut, and I could hardly breathe. They said it was mustard gas. I lay there on a stretcher, burning, my lungs feeling like they were on fire, waiting and waiting for something to ease it.
Oh,
Oh,
my,
fun fact, mustard gas could also contaminate the land, causing
uh
injuries days after the deployment.
that's right. That again, talk about certain lines that men spoke. My lungs feeling like they were on fire. Terrifying. I mean, mustard gas is even the most nefarious of all gases. First, no pain, nothing. You don't think anything's happened, and then afterwards, you're, maybe taking a break. You've got a little downtime, and bang, it hits you.
When you think of the
Terrible.
psychological impact, we were talking before about shelling
Yes.
to deny an area to the enemy, and you could shell it or cover it all with mustard gas. They don't even know they started advancing through it, and then what's that going to do to their morale afterwards when they realize that 4 hours, 6 hours later, when the effect starts to hit them, are they going to be a little bit more hesitant about following orders to take an
Correct.
advance across another
Yes.
area next time?
Yes. Yes, exactly. And we're talking a lot about mustard gas, chlorine gas, and I find it interesting that the deadliest gas was the one that escapes popular memory.
That's
So
right.
phosgene gas was one of the deadliest chemical weapons of the First World War. Now get this, 6 times more lethal than chlorine
Wow,
and responsible for roughly 85%
that's huge.
of chemical-related deaths. 85% down
And
to
then
phosgene.
no one knows it. Like anyone who's
No.
a relatively well-informed military history buff, you ask them about gas, you name a couple of gas, they would say chlorine or mustard.
Mustard, exactly, 100%. So phosgene, colorless and deceptively mild smelling, like musty hay, it often gave no warning until it was too late. Now, musty hay, remember, a lot of those soldiers are farm
Smelled like
boys,
musty hay himself.
right? Yeah, exactly. Like, oh, it's just musty hay. Yeah, I know that smell. Sadly, no, you don't. So it often gave no warning till it was too late, and its primary effect was to disrupt the blood-air barrier in the lungs, leading to pulmonary edema. Is that how you pronounce it?
Edema,
Edema.
pulmonary edema.
Edema. Fluid buildup that caused slow, suffocating deaths over 24 to 48 hours. So basically, phosgene, stealthier, felt like you had a cold until you drowned in your own lungs.
Good Lord. And to make it even worse, the French developed non-explosive shells that made its delivery even more insidious, as soldiers might mistake the quiet impact for a dud. They're like, whew, phew, that shell didn't go off. And then they would inhale the gas before realizing the danger. It was a stealth killer that added terror to every silent shell fall. Estimated that, as you said, 85% of the 91,000 deaths
91,000.
caused by gas in World War One were a result of phosgene. Wow.
And it would be the French that developed that shell.
Terrifying
Yes,
manner. Yeah. So
yes.
speaking of which, I mean, we're talking about the horror, so obviously it's going to have an impact on people. Why don't you tell us, how did gas change the psychology of trench warfare? Do you hear somebody?
Yes, I sense your editor is in the room
My editor
or
is
trying to get into the room.
trying to get into the room. Yes. We're going to take a pause here, folks, while I go kick my cat.
He has a few words to say on chlorine gas, I think.
Yeah, hold on. I'll be right back. Okay, so how did gas change the psychology of trench warfare?
So soldiers started fearing the wind, which makes sense. A breeze could mean death all of a sudden, not just a nice little cooling breeze anymore. It's a breeze of death. Helmets weren't just worn, they were clutched because gas had profound impact on the psychology of trench warfare, fundamentally altering the soldier's experience and mental state. While chemical weapons caused a relatively small percentage of total deaths in World War One, we said like 91,000. It's a big number, but when you take it in proportion of the overall conflict, it's quite true. It's a relatively small percentage. The thing was, it was their fear factor. That was formidable. The very real threat of being blinded, choked, or suffering agonizing burns created a constant undercurrent of anxiety that permeated daily life in the trenches. Again, remember, being gassed, you're helping your buddy, he's screaming in pain. And you get him back to the aid station, and they're trying to treat that. And then a doctor tells you, well, those blisters, they're on the inside too. So,
Yeah, good times.
that psychological fear is just incredible.
Men ended up they would sleep in their masks at times, which ain't fun. I've tried it myself, or even it's not even easy to try and to sleep. You can't even achieve it. Shell shock became layered with gas anxiety. Some faked illness to escape the trenches. Others froze up completely when sirens, the gas alarms would sound. The need for constant vigilance and the development of countermeasures also played a significant role in the psychological toll. Unlike ducking into your trench to avoid machine gun bullets or shrapnel, or burrowing deep in a dugout to avoid high explosive artillery fire, there was no escaping gas. And quite frankly, going down deeper was worse because gas is heavier than air. It'll come
Yeah,
get
that's
you.
right. And troops always had to be always on guard against poison gas. That was one of the lines that they were always told. And the insidious nature of our friend phosgene, which was colorless, as we had spoken about earlier, and often had minimal immediate effects. And that meant soldiers could be fatally exposed without even realizing it, leading to delayed and agonizing death. This lack of immediate warning likely fostered a sense of helplessness and an inability to trust one's senses because you just don't know, do you? And this colorless, odorless thing that's coming over you, and then a few hours later, you're not feeling so good. So that fear is palpable.
But were gas injuries survivable, and what was life like
That's a
after
good
exposure?
question.
So we've painted a pretty grim picture, but it was survivable, yes. But as I alluded to earlier, often with permanent damage. Many veterans had chronic bronchitis, emphysema, or went blind. For example, mustard gas caused the highest number of casualties, estimated of upward 120,000, but caused few direct deaths because the open air often kept concentrations below the lethal threshold. The mortality rate from mustard gas is only 2 or 3%.
Interesting figures there, Colin, aren't they? When you break it down into analytical numbers, uh, and the survivors of mustard gas exposure often endured long hospitalizations due to chemical burns and respiratory problems. So let's not forget the time afterwards that they spend being treated in a medical facility. Even after recovery, they were thought to be at higher risk of developing cancers later in life. And we were talking about this earlier on as well, right? You mentioned that very correctly, how they 5, 10 years later or so, all of a sudden these cancer cases are being discovered. So the long-term effects of sulfur mustard exposure primarily affected the respiratory system. So you've got emphysema, chronic asthma, chronic bronchitis, and I think one of the key words there is chronic. Like
Hmm. Hmm.
it's always coming back. You've got ocular complications that were also reported, chronic conjunctivitis, also known as pink eye to a lot of people, corneal opacities leading to vision problems. So there are a lot of accounts of this. Men who previously had 20/20 vision, perfect vision, forced to wear very high-powered glasses at the end of the war for the rest of their lives. And because documentation was poor, many gas soldiers were later denied pensions. Think about that. The psychological trauma was lifelong. Gas was a wound, well, it just kept on going.
Yeah, the gifts that keep on giving.
Mm.
Eh? So surviving a gas attack was possible, but it usually came at the cost of significant immediate suffering and potential long-term health problems that could severely impact a survivor's quality of life. Like my great uncle, Walter Robinson, I've mentioned him before on a couple episodes. He suffered from the effects of being gassed multiple times in the war, and he eventually died of, surprise, surprise, lung cancer about 20 years after the end of the war.
Terrible. There's an example right there, real life example for anybody who's wondering. So, Colin, why didn't chemical weapons see major use in World War II? I mean, it sounded so effective in use in World War I in many ways. Why did they do it in the Second World War?
Well, kind of boils down to a fear of retaliation. Germany had nerve agents. The Allies had mustard and phosgene, but neither side wanted to be the first.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
kind of playing a game of chicken, really. Any Allied chemical retaliation on German civilians was feared by the Nazis to be catastrophic. So President Franklin D. Roosevelt explicitly stated in June 1943 that any Axis use of a gas would be immediately followed by the fullest possible retaliation on their territory. And so the Western Allies also made comprehensive plans for defensive and retaliatory use of chemical weapons, and they stockpiled large quantities. The British, for instance, planned to use mustard gas and phosgene to repel a German invasion. That would have helped Operation Sea Lion. I don't know if you had a little
Yeah.
gas mask just for the sea lion itself, but there's a reason that all the photos of World War II troops in the UK, they always had a gas mask on.
Branding is key. Branding
But
is key.
branding is key. Branding is key. Ironically, Hitler himself had been gassed in World War One, and that personal trauma may have played a role in his decision to not order it being used in World War II. But make no mistake, everyone was ready.
Yeah, that's right. He, despite having no qualms about using poison gas against civilians in concentration camps, Hitler recoiled from using chemical poisons on troops. But that is exactly right, likely because he had been a victim of it. And in fact, uh, I think he was gassed in early October 1918, near the end of the war, in a place called Verwich in Belgium. And as a result, he was temporarily blinded, and he was treated at a hospital in Germany, in the town of Pasewalk. And it was there that I think people who know the accounts of the beginning of the Second World War, he received news of the armistice and the capitulation, and he decided that this is very bad. And well, we know what happened from then on. So while some within the Nazi regime urged the use of nerve agents against the advancing Soviets, for example, after Stalingrad, Hitler remained hesitant and never used them.
And let's not forget that the Wehrmacht's dependence on horse-drawn transport to create a vulnerability, as they had never developed effective gas masks for horses, and it's a pain in the ass to get a gas mask on a panicking horse.
Correct, yeah.
Imagine moving its head around and all that stuff. So it made making gas unusable for their army under many conditions, because like trucks and the Western armies were all motorized, except for the Allies were all motorized, and they can operate easily in a gas environment. Horses, not so much.
No. So it's important to note that chemical weapons were used in other theaters of the war. The Imperial Japanese Army used chemical weapons more widely in the Pacific theater against Asian allied armies, as they feared retaliation less from Western powers. Italy used mustard gas against forces in Libya and Ethiopia. The Nazis themselves did use poison gas extensively against civilians, particularly Jews, in the Holocaust, using Zyklon B, or as we call it, Cyclone B, and carbon monoxide for systematic extermination. And they experimented with various gases to figure out which was the exact right gas that will kill the most people in the shortest period of time. They also used toxic smoke and asphyxiating gas in limited combat situations against Soviet forces in places like Sevastopol and the catacombs of Odessa.
Scary stuff. So we see that after the extensive industrial use in World War I, everyone was kind of afraid to use it on the military side, except for the Japanese in World War II, and the Nazis a little bit in the Eastern Front. But so based on that hesitation, then what treaties emerged in response to the horrors of gas warfare?
Yeah. So how far back do you want to go in terms of banning poison warfare? Believe it or not, the first treaty, and this is really interesting, that dealt with poison gas or with poison was the Strasbourg Agreement of 1675 between France and Germany that banned the use of, wait for this, poisoned bullets. Clearly, there's been a long-standing concern about the use of poison in warfare. And specifically to gas, that came first with the Hague Convention of 1899.
Right. So this famous convention, the first of several, admonished nations to, quote, abstain from the use of projectiles, the object of which is the diffusion of asphyxiating or deleterious gases, unquote. That's pretty clear. Then again, I guess the Germans thought they were clever in getting around it by not using projectiles for their first, right? Those big canisters.
You must always read the small print.
This proposal was passed at the Hague Conference, which with only the United States dissenting. The American representative argued against restricting the inventiveness of Americans in developing new weapons. Yes. This convention entered into force in 1900, with a subsequent update in 1907. So everyone that we described before who was lobbing shells had all signed it. Okay, good.
Yes, let's not shackle the engines of capitalism as well. Let's see how much we can push this. So then in the 1925 Geneva Protocol that banned the use in war, signed at Geneva on June 17, 1925, and entered into force on February 8, 1928. The treaty states that the use of chemical and biological weapons is, quote, justly condemned by the general opinion of the civilized world, unquote. But development and stockpiling? Go ahead. Yeah, that's fine.
You're never going to use it, right? Because
you just want to keep it there. Let people look at them. So have tours. Unbelievable.
Only in 1993 did the Chemical Weapons Convention outlaw production, possession, and transfer. It has teeth, but of course violations still happen because an awful lot of chemical weapons have been stockpiled over the years. Disarmament began in 1997. Despite these efforts, there have been documented use of chemical weapons in conflicts since then, such as the use of sarin gas in the Syrian civil war in 2013.
That's right. And you mentioned just earlier on in passing about Obama's red line, the use of poison gas. But there we see the deployment of it, and still in our time, it's happening. So tell me, or tell us, how has the world's view of chemical weapons shifted since 1915?
Yeah, so it's gone from a battlefield tactic to international taboo. Cold War saw a significant increase in the development, manufacture, and stockpiling of chemical weapons by all the major powers. However, their battlefield use does remain rather limited. Notable instances include Iraq's use of chemical weapons against Iran and then again on its own Kurdish population in the 1980s, which was confirmed by the UN, but with limited or little international outcry.
That's right, yeah.
Egypt also used mustard gas and a nerve agent in Yemen in the 1960s. So these incidents demonstrated the continued threat and the use of chemical weapons despite the international norms and all these conventions.
That's right. And if I remember correctly, Saddam Hussein also used chemical weapons against the Marsh Arabs in his own country as well, and led to just shocking images. But there you go, still keeps on going. As we kind of alluded to, the taboo is fragile. We've seen gas in Syria, Iraq, and Ukraine. The memory of Ypres still matters, but only if we remember. The Cold War saw a significant increase in the development, manufacture, and stockpiling of chemical weapons by major powers. However, the battlefield use remained limited. Notable instances include Iraq's use of chemical weapons against Iran, as you mentioned, of course, again, the Kurdish population that you mentioned in the 80s, and all that has been documented, and the evidence is available for anyone who wants to go back and look at it. But I think what this really means, Colin, is that although we talk about the world says it's uncivilized, don't do it. You can kill people in other ways, but just don't use this way.
It's kind of ironic.
It's so ironic. But these incidents demonstrate that the continued threat and use of chemical weapons is happening despite international norms. I mean, it's just like, okay, fine, nodding value, and then use it anyway.
Yeah, so this has been a long episode, and we're going to wrap it up here. But I just wanted to, I think it was important to dive into it because the psychological impact and the overall impact that gas would have had on World War I, and then and the influence it would have had on World War II and other conflicts since is just too big to overlook for us. So, like in summary, the world's view of chemical weapons has evolved from one where their use, although it was horrifying, became a reality, and then almost, as we mentioned before, it became mundane. Went from a reality of warfare in 1915 to kind of just being routine business by 1917. And then it became a strong international norm against their use, development, and possession, although you could still stockpile it. And it was shrined in the Chemical Weapons Convention until 1997, when the production of it was banned.
That's right. Gas turned the very air into a weapon. And in doing so, it changed the way we think about war, humanity, and horror.
So here's to the men of the RMR and all the soldiers on both sides, quite frankly, who stood their ground even when the clouds rolled in. May we never forget what they breathed through.
And as a final toast, our fictional sponsor segment, and may we never breathe that again, but we will raise a glass
of Black Lung Lager, naturally.
To the brave, the blistered, and the bandaged.
Cheers to remembrance.
Cheers to history.